It's a story of two machines, two visions, with one history. And while we dig into that story, I'm going to be digging into some triage on an Atari STE and an Amiga 500 Plus. The Atari appears to have been beaten up, and the Amiga has suffered the dreaded battery damage. The rivalry between Atari and Commodore is often remembered as all-out war between the ST and the Amiga. The reality, however, is their biggest period of competition was during the 8-bit era.
Why buy just a video game from Atari or Intellivision? Invest in the wonder computers of the 1980s for under $300.
Commodore's VIC-20 and later C64 often called out Atari's 8-bit machines as being more expensive, really playing on Commodore's value for money aspect. Atari fired back, pointing out that the software library available for the C64 at launch was nothing in comparison to what was available for the Atari.
The Atari family is learning.
3 programs teach us to program.
The other.
We've only one.
And while the Atari family learns to play Centipede, Star Raiders, and Defender,
Gee, neat.
the other learned.
We made a mistake.
By the mid-80s, the battlefield shifted. Both Atari and Commodore had set their sights largely on IBM and Apple. Commodore with the C64 started targeting the IBM 5150 and the Apple II as their main rivals.
There's a new personal computer from Commodore, with a third more built-in memory than the Apple II, at half the cost.
As the industry moved into the 16-bit era, Jay Miner, who'd now been at Atari for many years and was the mastermind behind the earlier 8-bit systems, had grown quite frustrated that management refused to push hardware forwards. He decided the only thing he could do was to leave Atari and start his own company. He formed High Toro, which was later renamed to the Amiga Corporation. Their goals were ambitious: to create the next generation multimedia computer. However, developing cutting-edge technology requires funding, and that's where Atari entered the picture once more. In 1983, Amiga Corporation was in desperate need of capital to continue development. They secured $500,000 from Atari under a contractual agreement that allowed Atari to use whatever technology they'd developed if they defaulted on the loan. Meanwhile, things were afoot. Jack Tramiel's acquisition of Atari in 1984 changed everything.
Introducing the new Atari.
What a turnaround Jack Tramiel has wrought at Atari. Video game pioneer Atari rebounds finally into the black.
A big name in high tech is back in the news, and for a change, the news is good.
Tramiel, who had just left Commodore, had no interest in honouring the original Atari deal. He instead had his sights firmly set on the acquisition of the hardware Amiga Corporation was developing, and doing everything he could to make sure they fell short of repaying that loan. However, as fate would have it, Jack Tramiel, bringing with him a cost-cutting attitude and an aggressive pricing philosophy, when that was applied to the ST line of computers, they were rushed to market. Well, besides the damage to the case, the Atari appears to have nothing else wrong with it at all, making for somewhat of a dull restoration video. It's just the cracks in the case, which I will glue up and triage so that the machine can be put back together. Just to show that the machine does work, here's it testing on the bench. Sponsors of this video are PCBWay. They provide PCB prototype fabrication from as little as $5. They also have a huge library of shared projects, and if you're not confident with a soldering iron, you can even get them to assemble them for you. PCBWay also have CNC machining and 3D printing services. All of this is available at PCBWay.com. Thanks PCBWay for sponsoring this video. At this point, Atari's primary competitors were no longer Commodore, but instead Apple's Macintosh and IBM's 16-bit PC.
IBM charges too much for the memory it gives you, but Apple Macintosh Plus costs far too much for the memory it gives you. Atari won't do that.
Commodore, however, seeing this as a potential opportunity, swooped in and bought Amiga outright for $27 million. Show me the money! Outmaneuvering Atari and securing the rights to the technology themselves. This acquisition would set the stage for the Amiga 1000 and later the more affordable Amiga 500. The early Amiga 500 marketing also reflected this shift. Commodore positioned it not against the Atari, but against IBM and Apple's high-priced offerings. The two companies at this point were, by all accounts, like estranged cousins with a common enemy. The only direct reference to an Amiga in an Atari advert I can find.
It's a myth that the Amiga has the most memory for the money.
But at the same time, they took the opportunity to point out it also had twice as much RAM as the IBM 5170 and the Macintosh. At this point, it may have actually been more cost-effective, less paperwork, and a lot less hassle to have just renamed the company Commodore Atari and renamed Atari to Commodore. Repairing the battery damage is really just a tedious scraping away at damaged traces and solder mask to remove all the corrosion, and then a long and tedious process of metering through each and every pin and connection based on the original schematics. The rivalry extended beyond software and marketing. It was built into the very boards themselves. While the Amiga's PCB design was more experimental, machines that were built under Tramiel's cost-cutting regime are often built for mass production. And if you compare the Commodore 64 motherboard side by side with the original Atari ST board, you can see that these two are almost brethren through and through. So really the spiritual successor to the successful Commodore 64 is probably actually the Atari ST, and not, as many believe, to be the Amiga. The Amiga is really the spiritual successor of the Atari 800. Commodore really at this point were more of an enemy to themselves. Their continued mismanagement and rivalry between departments, let alone outside companies, led to much of their downfall. Taking all of that into account, yes, Commodore and Atari were competitive, but only in the sense that they were competing for market share against IBM and Apple. By 1993, the writing was pretty much on the wall for the home computer market. Microsoft and Apple had pretty much won the war, leaving machines like the Atari ST and the Amiga leagues behind. In the same way as the Atari STE's case is cracked and beaten and battered, Atari as a company came out of that period in much the same way, beaten and battered but surviving nonetheless. Without Atari and Commodore, the Amiga would not exist. And neither would the Atari ST. These two machines are linked at an almost quantum level. So this really is a story of two machines, two visions, with one history. At the end of that, the Atari STE probably needs a new case, which is something I'm going to look into in the future. And the Amiga needs, well, some more work. I'm pretty sure I can save this one. This one belongs to Matthias Bayes of Retro Sega Dev. If you found any part of this video entertaining or informative, then please click like. And if you like videos like this, why not subscribe to the channel? And in the meantime, why don't you check this out next?